All right, I'm going to talk briefly about salt marsh systems, but before I do, I realize that in my discussion about beaches and barrier islands, I neglected to mention that Alabama's beaches and barrier islands, or at least the beaches, are home to a couple of the more endangered mammals in the U.S. These two species, the Alabama beach mouse, Peromyscus polynotus amabates, and the Perdido Key beach mouse, Peromyscus polynotus tricelepsis, are both listed as endangered with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're found in the area that we're going to be visiting. They are quite similar in appearance. We're unlikely to see either of them, obviously, but the Perdido Key beach mouse is a little bit lighter in coloration, has a little bit more white on the face. I don't know for certain how accurate these two photos are in terms of generalities, but you can sort of get an idea from there. The Alabama beach mouse used to be found in the coastal dunes from Fort Morgan to Perdido Key, with the type locality being at Alabama Point. Presently, they are greatly restricted. The Perdido Key beach mouse is found today only on Perdido Key. The habitat is the primary dunes, secondary dunes, and also the scrub dunes in this strand community. They have some very interesting biology. They're monogamous, very high level of pair bonding. They actually feed on the seeds of sea oats and other plants. And while both of these are endangered species, the Perdido Key beach mouse has been designated as North America's most endangered small mammal. It was as the only known location at the time that it was listed back in the 1980s was at Florida Point, and it had been wiped out by Hurricane Frederick in '79. They thought there were just a few dozen of them remaining in the 80s. Between November and April of '88, they relocated 15 pairs to the Johnson Beach area of the National Seashore, and it was not long after that that they lost the Florida Point population, apparently largely due to predation by cats. So in 2000, a new population was established on Perdido Key. So there's now, at least as far as I know, there are two populations, one on Johnson's Beach and one at Perdido Key. All right, that sets us up for a discussion about salt marsh habitats. And we will see salt marsh probably in a couple of places. We might make a trip out to Point of Pines, where several of us have worked extensively over the last few years, but we will certainly see salt marshes. Salt marshes are coastal ecosystems that have are characterized by non-woody, salt-tolerant plants that occupy the intertidal zone, and that intertidal zone must occasionally be inundated with salt water. This would be a tidal inundation. As the tide comes in, the area is flooded, and then the tide goes out. We consider these in marine systems. We talk about them being tidally subsidized. The tide brings in clean water, oxygen, nutrients, and it takes out waste materials of a variety of sorts. So energetically and in terms of nutrients and materials, the area is subsidized by the action of the tides. We find salt marshes in areas where the wave energy is low enough for the soft sediments to accumulate. We find them far enough north that mangroves are not established. Salt marshes are among the most productive of all the world's ecosystems. You see them right here. They compare to estuaries and tropical rainforest in terms of the average net primary production on a per square meter per year basis. They also have a lot of other things that we find to be valuable characteristics. They stabilize sediments. They provide something of a buffer for storm protection. if you're in them at the right time and you're not particularly bothered by mosquitoes, they are beautiful areas. They are home to a tremendous amount of fish and wildlife, and as a result, we think they're well worth saving and appreciating, although not everyone agrees. Another slide that's left over from my subtropical class. Florida has tremendous coverage of tidal marshes, some 180,000 hectares. I don't know the number for coastal Alabama. I can assure you it's much less. I'll try to come up with a number. Regardless where you're talking about, though, the number decreases annually. These are very sensitive systems, and changes in water movement and, of course, anthropogenic man-made alterations have tremendously reduced the number of acres of salt marshes around the world. We'll see characteristics in salt marshes of both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Both food webs are in evidence there. The grazing food chain, supported by above ground vegetation, for example, this insect feeding on a salt marsh plant, most of that would be at the primary consumer level, would be things like insects and spiders. They would in turn be consumed by birds, reptiles, amphibians. However, the tremendous amount of plant growth provides a lot of detritus, decaying organic material, that supports another food chain, which apparently I don't have listed here on the slide. That would be the detrital food web, which takes place mostly within the sediments. Vegetation dies, it gets incorporated into the substrate, and all sorts of invertebrate organisms and also bacterial decomposition breaks that down. That provides a whole separate food web system, and the two only meet at certain places. There are a number of animals that might, for example, feed on detrital feeding consumers that would then take that energy out of the detrital food web and reintroduce it into a grazing food web. Typically find a network of tidal creeks, and we've spent a lot of time working in these tidal creeks. Tidal creek often they have a characteristic shape in 3 dimensions, sort of a flat bottom with sharply sloping sides as we slope up into the salt marsh vegetation. The dominant salt marsh species in Alabama and in the Florida Panhandle would be black needle rush. I think I'll be showing you pictures of these here in a second. Juncus vermerianus. That's a gray to blackish colored rush that's found along in the higher marsh areas. Salt meadow cordgrass, which is Spartina patens. That grows in areas that are periodically inundated. And smooth cordgrass, which is found in the lowest areas that are typically inundated daily by high tides. You'll find sawgrass in some areas. Sawgrass, cladium, is actually a freshwater plant. You sometimes find it along the upper edges of salt marshes, but all of these are tolerant of the salt that you get in sea spray. There are other plants also associated with salt marshes, but let me show you these first. This is Juncus vermerianus. This is black needle rush. Another look at Juncus. We'll see Juncus in abundance. It has a very sharp tip to the point here. You have to be quite careful moving around in it. Spartina alterniflora, smooth cordgrass, and I'm sure Dr. Keener will talk to you about the structure of the plant. I'm not going to attempt to. I'll let him do that. And in fact, I'll leave this slide up for a second as he discusses it. Spartina typically highest along the very edge of the salt marsh, where it's getting the greatest degree of subsidy from the tidal influence. Distichula spicata, this is salt grass. Another plant often found in these areas, this is Salicornia, a glasswort or a pickerel weed, and there may be other names as well. Correct me here, Dr. Keener, if there's something you want to add. Sometimes in these areas, and this could very easily be Point of Pines, it's not, but if the slope is very gradual as you move toward the land side of the marsh, you may have a flat area that we call a salt pan. These areas develop where the interstitial salinity, that's the salinity between the sand grains, is too high for vascular plants to survive. There's a very nice salt pan at Point of Pines. Somebody's knocking on my door. Let me pause. Okay. We find that salt marshes are important for animals for a lot of reasons. Probably the most significant reason is their role as what we call nursery grounds for a number of marine species. Because of the protection that's offered by salt marsh vegetation, because of the high level of production and all the abundant food that's there, a lot of not just Florida fish, but coastal fish in general, and not just fish, also some shellfish, things like shrimp. A lot of the early juveniles spend their lives, or the early part of their lives rather, in the protective environment of salt marshes. So, for example, here's the red drum, which actually spawns offshore, and then the larvae are carried into the nearshore waters, and the juveniles actually spend much of their first few months in the tidal creeks and the salt marsh systems. The same is true of spotted sea trout. This is a speckled trout or spotted sea trout larval stage. They also spawn offshore, and then the larvae move up into the salt marsh. This detrital food web is very significant here. As the salt marsh plants decay, all of that detritus gets incorporated into the sediment, supports a very rich microbial system. Those microbes serve as food for meiofauna, things like nematodes and harpacticoid copepods, and then small inverts or juvenile fish feed on those, and the energy gets incorporated once again into a grazing food web. Here's an illustration of that. It seems to be a kind of a blurred image, but the linkage between the grazing food web, or the detrital food web right here. Here we've got vascular plants. This would, for example, be the salt marsh vegetation. A lot of that dies. They indicate, for example, 90% of that is incorporated into detritus, whereas only some 10% is ingested by herbivorous insects. Of course, this would be the grazing food web over here. That 90% goes into the detrital food web, gets eaten by bacteria, fungi. They get ingested by microfauna, meiofauna, which are then in turn eaten by crabs and shrimp and small fish, and reincorporated into the grazing food web. We see salt marshes along most of the North Florida and Alabama estuaries. They require low energy, and so you would see, for example, salt marshes. If we can talk about Alabama systems here, the Mobile River system is certainly characterized by an abundance of salt marshes. Same slide that we saw earlier. This is a moderate energy area, so you have to get up into the estuaries to have low enough energy that salt marshes can accumulate. Actually, in Florida, when you get into this Big Bend area, you actually get some marsh establishment on the Gulf Beach itself because the wave energy is so low. Illustration again of the grazer and detrital food chains, which I won't go into here. Here's an illustration of some typical marshes. The ones we will see in South Alabama are going to be most akin to this Northwest Florida marsh, where we've got, here's the edge, this is the tidal creek. Typically we would see Spartina alterniflora, and then as you get away from that, you're usually going to get into juncus, the needle rush, tall juncus, and then short juncus. You might find some disticulus, some salicornia. This illustrates another region of juncus up here, and then ultimately they also indicate a Spartina patens region here, and then ultimately the trees. We'll have to actually get out in the field and see what we see, because I haven't really looked at closely at zonation patterns in the Alabama marshes. Salt marshes are of great value. I've already mentioned a few of them, but just to refresh your memory, tremendous nursery area for fish and a variety of crustaceans. They also filter out a variety of pollutants because they act almost as like a trap, as water that's come down the river systems before it moves out into the Gulf. The water passes through a salt marsh, and a lot of the salt marsh vegetation absorbs potentially hazardous chemicals. They stabilize sediments, keep them from washing offshore, and sort of in reverse of that, they serve as a buffer against the destructive influence of hurricanes. And there are a tremendous number of regulations. This is specific to Florida, the Warren B. Henderson's Wetlands Act, but a number of state regulations have been established for the protection of salt marsh systems. We've lost a lot of salt marsh in recent years. Louisiana is the poster child for salt marsh loss. The channelization of the Mississippi River has resulted in tremendous, it has prevented the deposition of salt marsh sediments, and as a result, as since it's a dynamic system, as they erode, the sediments not being replaced, and so Louisiana has lost tremendous acreage of salt marshes. Just skipping through some of these things that are Florida specific. We will probably take a seine and try to collect some salt marsh fish. Some of you have probably been down there with me and have seen some of these, but among the things that we're likely to see are things like Micropogon undulatus, the Atlantic croaker, the spotted sea trout, Cynoscion nebulosus. Of course, we'd be more likely to see larval or juvenile forms of these. It's the red drum. Very important coastal fish, and we collect juveniles in the salt marsh tidal creeks. Fish that's near and dear to my heart because some of my dissertation research focused on it. This is Liostomus xanthurus, the spot, which happens to be a myofaunal feeder. They actually take bites out of the substrate, manipulate that within their mouth, and strain out the myofauna. Several species of killifish that are common there. This is the Gulf killifish. This is the long-nosed killifish. And finally, the sheep's head minnow, the subject of Caitlin Bonham's research. And now somebody else is knocking on my door.